This was one of those texts that, since Darren and I work as a team, that we greatly enjoy, it would have been much nicer for Darren to preach this one and for me to preach about the parable of the soils. So I should have thought about this a bit more. But anyway, I think that we will have a tremendous amount to gain from a text that seems to be a bit rough around the edges, shall we say. So with that, let's dig right in. So one thing that I was thinking about is this is a report. This is a report from the lips of Micah. He says, "And I said," this is the first "I said" that we get in Micah. And the other thing is that he says that we should hear him. It's a very important word for Micah. The word "hear me," that phrase, it comes in chapter 1 and verse 2. It comes here, and it comes again in chapter 6 and verse 1. And so this continuing thought process of hear me, stop and listen, it actually gives us some sections to this particular book. Now, as it were, if you think about it, from the beginning, chapter 1 formed a section fairly neatly. Chapter 2 formed another section. And then chapter 3 begins the third section, but not in general, but the third section concerning judgments. And so this is the third judgment section. We will see a different section arising in chapter 4 as Micah proclaims God's coming. But for tonight, the first section of this, is that too loud? Good. The first section here. As I mentioned, this is a report. You know, it's striking of how many reports we hear on a daily basis. Now, some of us are really keen to wake up first thing in the morning and see what's going on in the news, what's going on in the world. Because for the first time in human history, you can know what's going on 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 miles away from where you live within a matter of minutes. You know, I received an alert when the concert hall was on fire that this event in Russia had taken place just within a few minutes of the event taking place. And it began to detail the sadness of probably what was going to unfold there. And for many of us, this ease of information, this age of information, as it's been called, has been quite troublesome to wander through. Because so often we can find so many things out that it becomes our focus. It becomes the way in which we see the world, the lens, as it were, of how we see the world. Am I right? I think I am, because in times of speaking to people, pastoral ministry, there's been a sense in which you walk in and you have a conversation with someone and you really know, or you at least have an idea maybe where their mind is or where their mind has been. Maybe they seem greatly distressed or worried, or fear has seemed to take hold. And you see that it's not fear that they would have maybe a meal or that their friend would not drop by to see them, particularly if they're shut in. But it may be a fear of what's going on in the world because they've seen so much of it, and so much of it is hard to bear. And there may be a fact in the fact that in taking all of this in, the reports repeating over and over again in the mind, have taken the priority, they've taken the spot that this one report, this primary report, this good report that we have in God's Word, where it should be. You know, I've had so many influences as of you. I think about the influences that we've had throughout the generations. The ones that are subtle, the ones not so subtle, the ones that are innocuous, the ones might not be so innocuous. The different things we were taught, the different things about the sciences, the different things about the Mass, in ways that would be different in which they're explained nowadays. You know, children in this generation would not know about small turtles that climbed into an ooze that was green and were transformed into fighting heroes. That might be something that my generation was more keen to understand. Speaking of Ninja Turtles, for those who didn't know. But those things, you know, they stick with us. They mark ages and time for us in our mind. And so Micah is marking time. He is giving us a description of the age in which he is living, a description of the culture and its leadership and what people are believing. Really, that's what's behind these words that are quite difficult to hear. These words that talk about great suffering and distress and evil. There are no other words for them. In fact, the first three verses rather, they describe scenes that we would rather never speak of or talk about, because these things are happening to real people in a real place, in a real time in which Micah lived. They are not far off. He didn't get an alert on his phone saying this is what happened. No, this happened to his neighbors. This happened to in his country. The city of Lachish that we spoke about earlier. If you go and see the Assyrian depictions of their joyful triumphs, as they would put them, the flaying of the people of Lachish was actually one of the scenes depicted. You can still look at it today. And so, really, these horrific images were the leaders of the day, the heads, as Micah puts it. It was their way in keeping everyone in check, to bring people under correct fear, correct being in their eyes of how they should be and how they should be in tenuous times. But Micah says it is wrong. It is absolutely wrong. But how's Micah going to reconcile it? How's Micah going to convince us that we need to be reconciled in our own minds to God and be drawn away from all of the reports that we may be hearing and tempted to believe? So in verse 1, he continues on, as he has in his other judgment scenes, and he says, "And I say, hear, you heads of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel." He's speaking to Judah and to Jerusalem. He's speaking to them as the heads. He's saying, you, in verse 2, who know better. You who should know better. You who know justice. Is that not your job? The answer is a resounding yes. They were supposed to know justice. What does he mean by justice here? Just so we have a clear picture of what Micah is demanding. Justice in Micah's world, in Micah's mind, and particularly in the Old Testament sense, it was the rightness and the proper order which should be taking place in God's kingdom. It was the rightness. It was the mitzvot, is how the Hebrews would have said it. And they would understand that this justice, this rightness that should be a characteristic of this time and this scene. missing. And the reason that justice is missing is quite simple. It's God is missing. God and his covenant promises and his right ways is missing from the scene. Micah is creating a link. And he's saying, if you know justice, if you know what is right, what is truly right and good, there is an indelible link between knowing justice and knowing God. It's a parallelism. And so he's saying, you have forgotten God, and therefore justice has been lost in the wilderness, and you don't even know what direction he has gone. That's the setting. That's the report. And so knowing this, we also understand that Israel, since they have left the God of their fathers, they have also left and forgotten the covenant responsibility that they had to govern rightly. Do you remember God says in taking on this covenant and being my covenant people, there are blessings associated with the covenant. And there are curses associated with the covenant. The blessings are, you will be my God. You will be my people, God says. You will be provided for. You will be given a land that was not yours, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that I have promised, a land whom I have promised to my servant Abraham. But also, and remember, if you should turn your back upon me and my covenants, and the curses will also come upon you. If you should go and you should worship other gods, if you shall be like an unfaithful wife, Israel, where will you turn for help? Because in your unfaithfulness I will not hear. I will not come running to save you. Seems exactly what has happened here is they have forgotten God, therefore they have forgotten justice, and therefore they have forgotten his covenants, love, and faithfulness. What is the end result of this? What is the end result of a culture, a society, a leadership, a judicial system? All of the above fitted together is that it has been turned on its head, what is right and wrong. And the end result is that this society, this culture, this judicial system, these kings, these rulers, even down to the priests, you will see at the end of this chapter, it's unhinged. It's absolutely unhinged because they have become a people that hate good and actually love evil. That is the description. Does anyone else, or has anyone else noticed this same pattern happening in any other places in the world, maybe even in more modern times? In societies and cultures in this world that we could name, we could describe by the characteristics that they actually hate good, and they actually embrace and love evil. What is this mark? What does this tell you about the heart? It is an absolute loss of moral anchor. It has come up from the depths, and the ship, what the picture is, the ship is now being wildly tossed about on the surface in the storm because the anchor has broken loose and there is no telling where the ship will land. Maybe on the rocks, but definitely off course. And that will be the case for the nation. It will be the case for its leadership. And ultimately, who loses in those moments? The people. How is God going to respond? How can this story have any sort of happy ending? How can this be reconciled? Well, we see that the leaders are responsible in this time that lacks justice and that lacks God. And it just seems absolutely impossible to our ears that someone could actually love evil. You say, this is hyperbole. This must be just an extreme case. This must be an allegory of sorts, as a warning for Micah. This horrific scene can't truly be what we are facing. And that's exactly what they would think. Because we see here actions against the oppressed. We see actions, very evil actions, being done against those that these rulers, that these nations would call their own people. That they would call God's people, the ones who had been provided for. And they were the ones responsible to protect them. Is that not what government, is that not what civil government, is that not what leaders are supposed to do? To work for the common good? To see justice done? To provide protection? So that people may flourish, may live in security, that the land may prosper, that they would see good things. Ideally, of course, admittedly, ideally. It hasn't always ended up. But particularly in Israel, in Judah, where Zion and the daughters and the sons of Zion lived, this is what should have been seen. But it wasn't. They should have been protected. They should not have known these things. But the land in which you walk, where God is not by your side, is a very dark and fearful place. Because it is a land in which people have turned and they've gone their own way. And they've said, I know best. And yet, what they've really done is embraced evil and turned aside from good. And what happens to the people that are supposed to be under the care of this type of leadership? What happens to the people who live under these kinds of regimes? What happens to the people in nations that have forgotten and trampled upon justice? Well, they become a people who are devalued. Life is cheapened. You've seen it over and over again. People are no longer humans, loved, made in the image of their immortal God. But rather, people are like chattel. People are that which can be bought and sold and numbered, ordered around, organized as one or a few see fit, either kept or disposed. It's whatever fits the purposes. And that's exactly how people are seen in Micah's day. They are people that were torn like animals. This is a scene like a slaughter from cattle. This is what happens when animals are slaughtered to be eaten, and yet we're talking about human beings. And so human beings have been devalued to a place because of this loss of grounding, because the anchor has burst from the bottom, and because the course is on a collision for disaster in the land. And you say that this cannot happen today. We are a modern society. We know better. People are more valuable than this. Why don't you talk to Fee afterwards? Ask her what she does during the week, who she talks to. Because if this doesn't happen, then what do you call an unwanted child being dismembered in his mother's womb or her mother's womb? It seems just as graphic, just as awful, just as devaluing, and just as numbered as any picture we see here. And so we see the values of a culture being tied to their position and where they are with God, where they are with his justice. Have they trampled it underfoot? Have they turned their backs upon him? Because it is conditional that these things would also begin to occur. Because priorities have been swapped. Good and right priorities have been swapped for those that are convenient, those that are profitable, those that would give gain and power. Been swapped for the priority of love and peace and hope and fulfillment. We've seen it done in the name of ethnic cleansing, genocide, persecution, subjection. And it still happens. You know, it may not be the most fun thing that I've ever had the opportunity to speak about, but it's a real thing. Because when we gain the perspectives that I mentioned earlier, when we turn on, however you receive your news, you see many of these things happening. And because we hear so much of it, how many times and how many numbers do we hear? And how many deaths do we hear about because of the various conflicts that we've even prayed for this evening? We hear 19 there and 130 here. We hear about a lot of loss of life. But sometimes, at least for me, I become a bit desensitized. They're far away and they become numbers. They aren't faces. They aren't children anymore wrapped in their mother's clothes. And so Micah's purpose is to bring back justice, to bring back truth, to bring back the reality of the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, to bring back the reality of his rule. That is his purpose statement in bringing our face, as it were, into the very fire of what's going on. And he's going to do that in verse 8. But before we get there, let me ask a question. Who really cares? Does anyone really care about these events? Does anyone really care in this land? Well, they should have. They absolutely should have. God's people should have cared. They should have risen up. They should have honored the position they were given in God's economy. How and why? Because actually the prophets would condemn Israel's leaders because they had stepped away from the responsibilities that they were given, because they were to be under shepherds under God. They were to be like shepherds, caring for God's people, treating them like sheep, leading them into green fat pastures, leading them beside still waters. And yet, what is Ezekiel's perspective of the situation? In chapter 34, he says, "The word of the Lord came to me and said, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, even to the shepherds, thus says the Lord God, Ah, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves." Job description priority number 1, incorrect. Supposed to be feeding the sheep. Should not shepherds feed the sheep? You eat the fat. You clothe yourself with the wool, and you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. The sheep are now being used for the shepherd's own purposes and not for the good of the herd and for even the master of the flock. So this isn't new. The weak you have not strengthened. You've just let them amble on. You've let them limp. You haven't gone. You haven't encouraged them. You haven't picked them up in your arms. You haven't carried them. You just let them limp. The sick you have not healed. The injured you have not bound up. The strayed you have not brought back. The lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them. So they were scattered. They became a sheep with no shepherd. They became food for wild beasts. My sheep were scattered. They wandered over the mountains on every high hill, which is an allegory, that they wandered into godless places. They wandered to shepherds who would not lead them or feed them, but that would lead them astray. And they were scattered all over the face of the earth with no one to seek for them. And so Micah says, does anyone really care? Who really cares in Israel? The shepherds do not care. But it brings me to a point, and it brings me to a point that I would like to bring to bear on our hearts. How do we think of others? Now, as ministers, as pastors, our people should be our utmost priority. Hands down. Solution. Bottom line. All of it. There is no greater priority. Because we have God's perspective on the situation here. When God speaks through Micah, what is he saying the problem is? He says, the oppressed are being crushed. The people aren't being cared for. And they are dying like animals. Period. That's not the perspective maybe we would have written on the scene. Maybe we would have seen, oh, Israel as a nation is being oppressed by Syria, and so they're doing all they can, including bringing people in check, because if they don't have the people fearing and bowing before the leadership, then they will be bowing before Assyria soon. There's lots of ways we could have looked at this scene. But God looks at it from his perspective, and he gives us his perspective. People come, God's people, loving our neighbor as ourselves. Heard this before over and over again. But they prioritize people before land, before wealth, before nations. That's how this passage prioritizes. It prioritizes not those that we would think that are worthy of being prioritized. Because there's certainly people that are worthy to be prioritized, right? But this, Micah points out, these are the ones who are prioritized. The poor, the broken, and the oppressed. That's not our priority list. And so, continuing on who really cares, the Lord cares. God in heaven cares. And he's going to make that clear with a very, very pointed statement from Micah in verse 8, as I've hinted to, and we'll get there in a moment. But just as a proof, Jesus' first sermon, he picks up on this theme. He goes into the synagogue, he pulls out the scroll of Isaiah, and what does he read in his first sermon? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, from Isaiah chapter 6. The Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to those who are in peril, and to open the prison for those who are bound. Jesus' first sermon, his priority list, is the oppressed, the broken, the people who have been sidelined. For the greater priorities, for the greater purpose of men. And he says, who's listening? Who is going to hear me? Because that's what Mike is asking. Do you remember this morning? Who's listening? That was what Jesus was wanting to hear in the parables. That was the point of the parables. Listen to me. Micah says, who's listening? You think you're listening. The prophets think in verse 5 through 7. The prophets think that they are hearing voices, but they are receiving visions. But instead of visions, they see darkness. Why? because these who have been wandering astray, these who have been persecuting the poor, the broken, these who have wandered far from God, and who have exchanged his good judgment for their own. Now, when things get thorny, when things become trouble, now they want to run back to God and say, okay, this is not going well. I've exhausted all of my resources, the resources that belong to the poor people that you have now taken from. So, as a last defense, I think we should go back to God. And God says, no. When you pray, I will not hear. When you come to me and want to hear my voice, you will hear nothing. When you desire visions, you will see darkness. When you cry peace, because you have no peace, what does he say in verse 5? When they have something to eat, but declare war against him who puts nothing into their mouths. God says, you only cry and come to me when you run out of options. When you think that everything is over. You have forgotten me. And in verse 6 he says, therefore night shall be to you without vision, darkness to you without divination. Even the false prophets who wouldn't come to God, even those who would go to witches, even those who would turn to evil spirits to hear from God, even they aren't hearing anything. Because God has brought a curtain of darkness to show that there is one God in all of the earth. And he brings them to shame. They'll cover their lips because they don't have any good answers. They're out. They can't even make this up. There is no answer. And when all seems to fade, when there are no answers left, when God says, I am silent to a disobedient people, I am silent to ones who have turned their backs, I am silent to ones who have ignored my covenant promise, I am silent to ones who have worshipped everything under every tree except me. Micah says, let me remind you again. Let me tell you the story. But as for me, speaking as Micah, I am filled with power, real power, not the things that you've been looking for. I have been filled with power. What kind of power? Power from the Spirit of the. It's emphatic. He says, you've heard silence. Now you will hear thunder as from heaven, because the Lord is speaking. And what does he speak? How do his words compose? They compose themselves of justice and of might. You have brought justice that you've orchestrated in your own minds, and it has been like a calamity. But now I will bring justice and might, and I will declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. I will take that which has been inverted. I will take that which has been called good but has been evil, and I will turn it back, and I will say, what you have done has been evil, and I will show you good. Because I am the Lord who is God. That's what Micah brings to us in verse 8. I was reminded of a time in which Jesus spoke about justice that is to come in a very similar context. I thought it would be worth mentioning before we close. Because in Luke chapter 18, there is a very familiar parable, if I can say that correctly, not pebble, as was reminded this morning. I'll tell you about that one later. He says this, He told them a parable to the effect that they are always to pray and not to lose heart, because that is our tendency when we think that all the world is coming down around us. When we see injustice in every nation and in every turn, and we see no reprieve in sight, we tend to lose heart. Our eyes turn inward. We look to ourselves for answers where there shall be none that will be found. And Jesus says, when you are tempted in that way, do not lose heart and go to prayer. Go to the Father, run to him. And he said, let me tell you why. Because in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected men. He didn't care. He did it his own way. Sound familiar? He said, in a certain city there was a judge, and there was a widow in that city who kept coming to him, saying, give me justice against my adversary. Sound familiar again? For while he refused, he said, no, go away, woman. My time is not taken up with your lot. But afterwards he said to himself, though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, it's his own comfort that he's worried about at this point, just to be clear. Because she keeps bothering me, I will give her justice, proper justice, right justice. Not because it's what is right, but because of his own desires. So that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge says. See the Lord's commentary on him. He's an unrighteous judge. And will God not give justice to his elect, who cry to him day and night? Will he delay over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? There's a whole sermon in that, just a few points. Jesus is saying this. When you find yourself in a place in which all you feel is that there will be no answer to your asking, there will be no answer to the injustice. If an unrighteous judge can come and can give an injunction, can give a right order, even out of a wrong motive, shall not your heavenly Father, who is the King of all justice, the Prince of all peace, shall he not come on behalf of those whom he loves and bring justice? It says, yes, and he will even bring it speedily, quickly. And you say, I've been asking for quite some time. And we've asked over and over, keep asking. He hears. But he is bringing justice swiftly in his mind, in his own perfect timing. That he will do it in the appropriate time in which he will use to bring himself glory, and he will sustain you in the process. That's what he did with this widow. But he asked, when he does come, when things are set right, when justice comes to bear upon this world, and all things will be opened, and the books will be opened, and he returns, what will he find? Were we faithful? Did we trust him? Did we seek justice even when we, like Micah, were in a very small minority? Were we faithful even in that minority moment? Did we look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith? Did we trust him? And says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And did we trust in his provision thereafter? So Micah bringing to bear a little bit about our lives and how we should live in these days. Faithfully trusting the one who will bring justice and who is justice and light. Let's pray.